Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Happy Women's History Month. March is Women's History Month, and for this month I just wanted to do a few different videos related to female author books, female narrators, etc. to just give some recommendations if you're looking for stories about women and for women. So for this video I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite books with female protagonists and written by women as well. So for this video I chose quite a few books that are just personal favorites to me, but I also tried to create a range of different experiences and kind of give a more broad definition of womanhood in my protagonists that I've chosen. I didn't want this to be a girl boss kind of video where we just talk about strong and powerful women or women who are defying norms and everything, which is a wonderful topic and I'm so glad that exists and there's so much literature surrounding that. But I think it's also important to show the other side of the coin, which is women who are struggling, women who are sad, women who are morally gray and make bad decisions. In order to have a equal representation of women, we need to encompass a bunch of different experiences and ideas. So first, I would like to talk about an author who writes a lot of female main characters, especially unlikable ones, and that is the queen herself, Ottessa Moshfegh. So I have two books to recommend by her. These are my two personal favorites, My Year of Rest and Relaxation and Eileen. Eileen is my #1 favorite by her, and this one follows a young woman named Eileen who works at a prison and she has a really weird relationship with her father. Eileen is a very unlikable character. She regales us with stories of her bowel movements and other bodily functions, etc. It's just a lot. When you read this book, there is a sort of visceral reaction of disgust that happens. And I have to commend Ottessa Moshfegh for her ability to create that response in us, because this narrator is just so creepy and gross and weird and unlikable. And honestly, I can't say there's many other books where I've hated the protagonist so much. And that's what makes this book just absolutely incredible. So definitely check out Eileen if you are looking for an unlikable narrator or somebody that kind of exemplifies the more gross and strange aspects of femininity. Speaking of gross women in literature, I came across an article the other day by, I believe, Refinery29, talking about how literature has been more accepting of gross and strange female characters than they ever have been, and how so many books like Ottessa Moshfegh's books have been accepted and loved and welcomed into the literary scene, which is very exciting. And the article also talks about how in order to provide a well-rounded look at womanhood and femininity, we need to be including the more grotesque aspects of womanhood and daily life, because we're all humans and we all have nasty, gross things about us. And even if that's not something that we usually talk about, having that come to the forefront when women are expected to be beautiful and perfect and the pinnacle of purity at all times in real life and in literature, we need to have a more realistic look at womanhood in the 21st century. So I will link that article down below because it's a really, really interesting read. But I also just wanted to talk about My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. This was the first one I read by her, and this narrator is unnamed, and basically she decides that her life is terrible and she wants to take a year off. And she does this by getting a kind of quack psychiatrist prescribe her a bunch of medication so that she can just sleep and forget and not interact with the world for a year. So this character is very unlikable, and Ottessa Moshfegh also kind of gives commentary on privilege and how privileged this character is, that she can take a year off basically. She doesn't have to work, she doesn't have to support herself, she can do nothing but just rest and take pills and just totally zone out from life. But she has enough money from her family to be able to do that comfortably and not worry that the power is going to go off or something like that, or she's not going to have food. So there is a certain amount of haziness to the narration. It feels very removed and distant, which is really interesting for a narrator. And it just feels like we have to really make our own conclusions and our own commentary on what's going on, because our narrator is not really giving us a lot because she is so far removed. So it is a really, really fascinating book, and this narrator, who is unnamed, is one of my favorites. So next up is a book that I've talked about a lot, but I want to recommend it in this video because it's a favorite of mine, and that is Hysteria by Jessica Gross. So this one follows our unnamed main character, and she is in the throes of a sex addiction, and she goes to a bar one day and she thinks the bartender is Sigmund Freud. So when I picked up this book, I was like, wow, that is such an interesting concept. I have to read this book. And it is one of the strangest books I have ever read. I read it and I felt like I was in a fever dream. It was just craziness. But the point of having Freud involved is that it is a Freudian look at her life, basically. It's a look at her childhood and the ways in which her relationship with her father developed into her current situation. So it definitely looks at her life through that Freudian lens, which is why Sigmund Freud is a part of the story. So the concept is very interesting, but reading about that through the perspective of someone who genuinely thinks that they saw Sigmund Freud at a bar is such an interesting perspective, because it's so obvious to us that she's wrong, that that wasn't Sigmund Freud, but reading about it from her perspective makes us sort of understand where she's coming from. So it is a very, very interesting book. It's very weird, and there is a lot of sexual discussion in this book, so if that's something that grosses you out or makes you uncomfortable, maybe not for you. I just feel like in these kinds of books, we get so much more description and so much more understanding of female sexuality, where we usually don't get a lot of that. It's very much closed off. It's not something that is acceptable to talk about, especially the more raw, visceral aspects of it. Whereas historically, those types of things were much more acceptable for men to talk about. Okay, I have a few more books in the sort of unlikable female main character category, and I know I'm recommending a lot of these, but I read a lot of them, and I think they're such a fascinating sort of subgenre because, like I said, we get to see a very different side of womanhood and femininity, so I'm just gonna continue recommending them to you. So we have Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. This one I read, I think in October of last year, and oh my gosh, I fell in love with this book. It was one of my favorite books of the year. It is about a woman named Irina who is a photographer, and she specializes in taking photos of men and younger boys potentially in compromising positions, in compromising outfits, etc. And basically we follow that whole situation as she descends into her addiction and eventually descends into madness, basically. So Irina is very unlikable in that she is self-sabotaging for sure, but also she's just not really a nice person. She isn't kind to anybody. She takes advantage of people, and the kind of work that she does is kind of manipulative and inappropriate in a lot of ways, because some of these boys aren't necessarily consenting to everything that she is putting them through. So this book features a much more extreme character and situation than most of the others, and this definitely fits into a lot of the really thrillery tropes where it's not about realistic sexuality. It's very over the top in a lot of ways, so it doesn't feel like a realistic and raw discussion of female sexuality. It is definitely a thriller, psychological kind of book. But I love that because a lot of thrillers and psychological books like that are from a male perspective, or if they're from a female perspective, they don't really get down to the core of the woman character's desires or anything like that. It is a very disturbing book, so be warned, but I just loved reading from a female character who was so twisted and strange and was making horrible, horrible choices. Because in some ways I could relate to her, and in other ways I could completely not relate to her, and that was such an interesting experience. Because honestly, I struggle to connect to male protagonists and male narrators, so having a very thrillery, intense book from a female character was amazing and right up my alley, and I loved it so much. Moving right along, we have a somewhat controversial book. I feel like people either love this book or they hate it, and that is The Pisces by Melissa Broder. So this book is pretty weird. It follows a woman named Lucy who is really struggling with her mental health, and she decides to house sit for her sister. Her sister's kind of rich, and she has to go house sit for her and dog sit, and And while she's doing that, she meets a merman. She's out on the coast of California, I think, and she's down by the water and she just meets a merman. And it's sort of about how they start a relationship and all of the crazy things that happen as a result of that. I would say that a large portion of this book focuses on sex and female sexuality, and it's definitely very weird and at times very gross and strange and almost too much in a way, but it's just right on that edge where it's not too much. I think it can definitely be too much for a lot of people, but I just found it just enough where it makes you sort of uncomfortable, but not too uncomfortable, if you know what I mean. So in some ways, this is a challenging read because it is uncomfortable in some ways, but it's also a very fun, fantastical read because obviously this is not rooted in real life. Obviously, some of the struggles that Lucy has are rooted in real life, but the whole merman thing makes it feel much more like urban fantasy. So there is a sense of escapism and fantastical stuff going on, but it feels realistic enough where you can sort of relate to her and feel her pain, even if you can't necessarily relate to everything she's going through. So this is a super, super weird book, one of the weirdest books I've ever read, but it's definitely a very, very interesting look at a female protagonist. So next up, we have another of my favorite books of 2021, and that is All's Well by Mona Awad. So I read her other book, Bunny, in the beginning of 2021, and I read this one closer to the end of 2021. So Bunny is also amazing, and I know a lot of people love that one way more than this one, but personally, I just connected to this one so much more. So this one follows a woman named Miranda who is teaching All's Well That Ends Well to a bunch of college students. And Miranda is struggling with a sort of nebulous chronic pain that is undiagnosable, untreatable, and she can't figure out how to deal with it. So in Mona Awad fashion, there are a lot of sort of unexplained magical things going on, very strange occurrences, and witchy kind of vibes also. So on the cover, there are a bunch of pills, and that alludes to the fact that Miranda is constantly taking pills. So she is very unreliable in that she is constantly on some kind of prescription medication. And she also just has these very strange hallucinations, or she believes things to be true when they're maybe not. So she's very unreliable. But I feel for her so deeply because she is just struggling with this nebulous chronic pain, and she doesn't have anyone to support her or to help her through it. Her husband has left her, her friends are sort of getting tired of dealing with the whole thing, and she has to try her best to pretend that everything's fine all the time when she can't even walk properly. So while this is a very weird psychological horror twisted kind of book, it also delves very deeply into an aspect of life that women face quite a lot, which is chronic pain and autoimmune disorders and things like that, which statistically affect women quite a lot more than men. And I think the combination of Miranda being very unlikable, but also we feel for her because she is in chronic pain, makes for a very balanced character and a balanced story where you're not totally hating her, but you don't totally sympathize with her. And because of that, I feel like it creates a very realistic sort of environment, even though a lot of things that are going on are not realistic. But having that juxtaposition definitely roots it in reality and makes us feel like the character could possibly be real, because no one is 100% good or bad or unlikable or sympathetic. We always have that duality going on. I really, really loved this book. I just had a blast reading it as well. It's a very fun, fast-paced book, so yeah, that's All's Well. All right, next up we have a classic that I'm going to recommend, and it is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. So this book follows a young woman named Esther who is dealing with some mental illness, and she's at college, and it basically just follows her throughout her college experience. So we watch Esther's breakdown, but we also feel like we're very involved in Esther's breakdown because the character just completely sucks us in, and that is completely due to how amazing Plath was as a writer. She was incredible at creating narratives and characters that completely suck you in. I just think this is a very important book, and it is a book that I think everyone should read at some point. So that is The Bell Jar. Next up, we have another 2021 favorite, and that is Mostly Dead Things by Kristen Arnett. So this one takes a very, very different approach to the female main character. Our narrator, Jessa Lynn, is the daughter of a taxidermist, and the family has a taxidermy business. And when her father dies, she decides that she is going to carry on the business. So the book is about taxidermy and how she expresses herself creatively through taxidermy, but it's also about how Jessa Lynn took on her father's role basically in the family when he died. She has to be the stable one, the rooted one, the strong one, the one who takes care of everyone else. And because of that, she feels like she has to shut down her emotions, that she can't be expressive, that she can't love or be playful or fun or enjoy her life. She has to be this pinnacle of stability. So this takes a pretty different approach to womanhood and femininity than the other books that I've recommended, because she definitely takes on a more traditionally masculine role. Even though she is struggling, she has to be strong, she has to be composed at all times, and that is something that we traditionally associate with a more masculine presence. So if you're looking for something a little bit different and off the beaten path, Mostly Dead Things is incredible. Alright, next up we have Magma by Thora Hjóleifsdóttir. This was my favorite book of 2021, and it follows a young woman named Lilia who is in a very manipulative, abusive relationship, and she really can't see what's going on, and even when she does, she doesn't have an out. I've talked about this one a lot, so I'll keep it brief, but it basically discusses how difficult it is to get out of an abusive relationship when you are entrenched in it. It is so heartbreaking to read from her perspective because you as the reader can see what's going on, but she can't. So it's frustrating for the reader, but it's also just absolutely heartbreaking. So this is a very hard book to read, so just know that going in. But this is one of the most powerful books I have ever read, if not the most powerful book I've ever read. And Lilia is a fascinating and heartbreaking narrator. All right, the last section that I have for this video is all books about motherhood. I know I've talked about most of these in depth, so I will go kind of quickly, but the first one is Die My Love by Ariana Harwicks. This is about a woman in the French countryside who is battling her demons, embracing exclusion yet wanting to belong, craving freedom whilst feeling trapped. So it's about the character feeling trapped in domesticity and being unable to deal with being a mother. She becomes kind of violent, she becomes unable to take care of herself and her child. It's a very heartbreaking book, but it also provides insight into postpartum depression, as well as the general feeling that motherhood was not what you expected, or just that the cycle of domesticity makes you feel trapped. So this is a very intense yet poignant read, and this character is fascinating to read from. And when you read this book, you just feel deeply for her. So this is translated from Spanish by Sarah Moses and Carolina Orloff, and it's published by Charco Press, and it is incredible. In a similar vein, we have The Shame by McKenna Goodman. So this one follows a woman named Alma who basically decides to run away from her life in search of something else because she feels so incredibly trapped in the cycle of her domestic life. She feels that she has lost her identity and she needs to go and find it back again. So it's about that journey, and in a series of flashbacks we see everything that led up to that moment. And it's also about how easy it is to become obsessed with social media and to idolize people on social media, especially someone who is struggling with motherhood and watching other people really seem to succeed at motherhood on social media. And sort of tying those two things together, I think it's about how Alma feels like she has lost connection and lost place, and she feels a connection to someone over social media, and that creates the obsession because she's so desperate for connection, and her loneliness really makes her feel like she has to go after someone who may or may not be real. So that is The Shame by McKenna Goodman. And then finally, we have my second favorite book of 2021, and that is Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. So this one is set in Nigeria and follows a woman who is unable to get pregnant, and her mother-in-law basically brings a new woman into the house and says, you have to have a child with this woman because your existing wife can't have your child. So it's about the dynamics of her marriage and her relationships with her family, and it's also very much rooted in Nigerian practices, culture, society, traditions, etc. And there is so much in this book that you're not aware of going into it. So much happens that I certainly didn't expect at all. And reading about it from her perspective just makes you feel for her so deeply, and it is so incredibly heartbreaking. She is very likable and very sympathetic, and throughout I could not help but feel heartbroken for her. I never felt like she was in the wrong. Even though everyone else in the story kind of thought she was in the wrong a lot of the time, I just felt so sorry for her, and I felt her pain. mine, and I just wanted to give her a big hug because she just went through so much. So that is Stay With Me, and that is the final recommendation for this video. So those are some of my favorite female narrators / protagonists in female authored books. If you have any recommendations for more books like this, please leave them in the comments so we can all share our ideas. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.